All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to our explainer on what is, absolutely without a doubt, the fundamental building block of modern civilization. We're going to explore a truly fascinating story today, looking at how engineers have spent the last 75 years solving one impossible physics problem after another. I mean, if you strip away the glowing screens, the software, the fancy algorithms, what you're ultimately left with is the transistor.
Now, take a look at this number, 100 billion. What's so crazy about this is its sheer, almost incomprehensible scale. The device you are using to watch this explainer right now contains more than 100 billion sub-microscopic transistors. Just to put that into perspective for a second, you literally have more of these tiny switches in your pocket right now than there are stars in the entire Milky Way galaxy. But, how exactly did we get here?
Section 1. The first magic switch.
Picture this. We're jumping back to Bell Labs in December 1947. A room goes completely quiet as researchers John Bardeen and Walter Brattain successfully control an electrical signal. But here's the kicker. They do it without using fragile, hot vacuum tubes and without any moving parts whatsoever. Using just a tiny sliver of purified germanium, they do something that completely stretches the limits of known physics at the time. The core idea of this very first germanium transistor was almost offensive in its simplicity, honestly. It was a single, solid device that could be flipped on or off. But even more than that, it could take a tiny whisper of electricity and turn it into an absolute shout. It was an amplifier and a switch packed into one tiny body, with no vacuum, no moving parts, and zero delay.
Moving on to Section 2. The material war, silicon and the p-n junction.
Now, despite the Nobel Prize-winning brilliance of that first germanium transistor, it had a fatal flaw. It absolutely hated heat. It would misfire and completely fail in the real-world conditions of, say, a hot car dashboard or a stuffy factory. So, to mass-produce the future, engineers had to pivot to a material found abundantly in literally every grain of beach sand on Earth, silicon. But here's the thing. Pure silicon on its own is actually pretty useless. It conducts almost nothing. It has to be manipulated. We do this through a process called doping, where we deliberately contaminate the silicon in extremely precise parts per million. If we add phosphorus, we get N-type silicon, which gives us an extra free-moving negative electron. And if we add boron, we get P-type silicon, which creates a hole, basically a missing electron that acts exactly like a moving positive charge.
So, if you press that N-type and P-type silicon together, you get the real magic, the p-n junction. Right at the boundary, a depletion wall automatically builds itself, stopping all current. But if you apply a forward bias voltage, boom, that wall collapses and electricity flows freely. Flip the voltage backward to a reverse bias, the wall thickens up and stops the current dead in its tracks. It's a genuine marvel of physics, creating a perfect, solid-state one-way valve for electricity.
Section 3. Solving the heat crisis.
Okay, so once engineers had this perfect silicon valve, the race was immediately on to pack as many of them as humanly possible onto a single piece of silicon. But as they started cramming hundreds of these tiny components together in the early 1960s, a brand new enemy emerged: sheer density and self-destructive heat. If we follow this timeline from the 1947 germanium model to silicon bipolar transistors in the 50s, we run into a massive problem. Those bipolar chips ran incredibly hot. They were just constantly hungry for power. If we had stayed with bipolar transistors, modern computing literally would have melted down. And that forced an architectural revolution in 1960 with the MOSFET, followed a few years later by the CMOS circuit.
To rescue the microchip, they had to totally rethink the underlying physics. The older bipolar transistor used continuous current to stay on, which, as you can guess, generated massive heat. But the MOSFET, it didn't use current to control current. It used a voltage field. It created an electric field that reached right through an insulator to flip the switch on. When they paired that with CMOS logic, the standby power dropped to almost zero. It completely solved the bipolar heat crisis and, virtually overnight, became the dominant technology of the modern world.
Section 4. Moore's Law and Scaling.
So, with heat finally managed, the semiconductor industry set its sights on one relentless defining goal: making these things smaller and packing way more of them onto every chip. You've probably heard of Moore's Law, right? Back in 1965, Gordon Moore observed that transistor density roughly doubles every 2 years. But what's really fascinating here is that this wasn't actually a law of physics, not at all. It was a law of human organization and economic incentive. The entire global supply chain essentially organized itself to make this self-fulfilling prediction a reality for 4 solid decades. That is, until engineers ran headfirst into the submicroscopic wall of the quantum world.
Because right around the year 2000, things got incredibly weird. We hit what's known as the gate oxide crisis. We had shrunk the insulating layer inside the transistor down to 1.2 nanometers. Guys, that is literally just 5 atoms thick. At that tiny scale, electrons just stopped obeying classical physics altogether and started quantum tunneling right through the closed gate. The transistor couldn't even reliably turn off. Intel finally solved this in 2007, not by making the insulator thinner, but by making it smarter, introducing high-K dielectrics, like hafnium oxide, to finally stop the leakage.
But of course, the shrinking didn't stop. And by 2011, the traditional flat, 2D planar transistor simply ran out of road. It was leaking way too much current again. So engineers fundamentally changed the geometry. They moved from a flat, 2D planar transistor to the 3D FinFET. Instead of a flat channel, they actually raised the silicon into a vertical fin and wrapped the gate around 3 sides of it. By surrounding the current path like that, they regained total control and stopped the leakage cold.
Section 5. Logic gates and memory.
Okay, so we've engineered the perfect microscopic switch. We've solved the heat, and we've solved the quantum leakage. But how do billions of these tiny valves actually coordinate to do something useful for us, like load a web page or render a video game? Well, it all comes down to the ultimate magic trick of computing: abstraction. A single transistor on its own is just a switch, but wire a few of them together and you form a NAND gate. NAND gates are these universal building blocks. Build enough of them and you can create logic operations like AND, OR, and NOT. Group those together and you get adders and multipliers. Group those together and boom, you have a processor. This hierarchy perfectly abstracts away the mind-blowing reality that underneath it all, it is just billions of switches flipping billions of times per second. And they don't just calculate either, they have to remember. For memory, we basically rely on 2 main strategies. DRAM acts like a leaky bucket made of 1 transistor and 1 capacitor. It loses its charge in mere milliseconds, meaning your device has to frantically refresh it thousands of times a second just to remember what it's currently doing. Meanwhile, flash memory, the stuff used in your SSD, actually traps electrons permanently inside an insulated floating gate, remembering your data even when you completely turn the power off.
Which brings us to Section 6, hitting the quantum limit.
As we sit here today, chipmakers like TSMC are pushing down into 2 nanometer process nodes. The transistor channel is now measuring just a handful of atoms across. And once again, the ultimate enemy is physics itself. At this unimaginably tiny scale, we're dealing with quantum decoherence. An electron moving through a transistor is no longer a classical particle acting predictably. It acts as a probability wave. The transistor has essentially become a probabilistic device. We've reached a point where engineers literally have to use statistical error correction across the entire chip just to keep the machine running accurately.
But here is the absolute game changer. Instead of fighting these mind-bending quantum effects, we're actually learning to use them. We are officially moving into the era of qubits. Quantum computers exploit these probability waves and superposition to perform calculations exponentially faster than any classical machine ever could. So, the transistor story is branching out. The future isn't just quantum. It's a stage shared by incredibly dense classical processors working hand-in-hand with new quantum machines.
To wrap up our explainer today, I really want to leave you with this mind-bending reality to chew on. The transistors inside the device you are using right now, they are actually smaller than a coronavirus, and they are switching faster than you can even formulate a thought. From a simple block of germanium that acted as a clumsy little valve for electricity, we have constructed a system so incomprehensibly complex, it has entirely redefined what human civilization is capable of imagining. So when you turn off your screen today, ask yourself, what will the next 75 years of this invisible war against physics look like? Thanks so much for joining me, and as always, keep questioning the technology right in front of you.